Hey everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It's Dan, and we're back with another show for you all. Hope you're having a great week. You know, with this podcast, I like to talk about a wide range of subjects. And the one that we're going to talk about today is false allegations, which I've covered before on the podcast. I've had a couple of guests on who've been directly affected by it. Ended up in jail. Both were exonerated, but it's still affecting them even now, months and years later. But today I'm going to go a little bit different. I have an expert on, and I'll bring him on in a moment. But what I wanted to say to the listeners is a lot of people don't understand how devastating false allegations can be to the person that's being accused. And we're not trying to minimize any real allegations in any way, shape, or form. And I know my guest agrees with me on this. They all should be taken seriously. They all should be thoroughly investigated. And if someone is guilty, they absolutely should be charged, and whatever the results are, the punishments are, should be applied. I wholeheartedly believe that. But I also see the other side of it. I do see the primarily men, but I've also seen women who have been falsely accused of a lot of different things. It could be, sexual allegations. It could be domestic violence allegations. And the effect on those that are accused wrongfully is every bit as devastating. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about. So my guest today is Sean Parker. Sean is a author, artist, musician, and I'm going to ask him about that because I'm a musician, and an academic, and he's also the editor of the False Allegations Watch. So let me bring on my friend Sean. Hello, Sean. Nice to see you. How are you today?
Hi, Dan. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm fine.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, well, two things I want to ask you, just to kind of introduce you to the audience, is you've written a number of books, and you've given a TED Talk. And as I said to you off air, one of my goals in life is to do a TED Talk. So just for a few seconds, can you kind of talk about what you talked about and what that was like?
Sure. In 2013, I was living in Istanbul. At the end of 10 years of to teaching there, English and cultural studies, and being a musician. And I was asked, being a writer, if I wanted to do a TEDx Moda talk. So it's the TEDx, obviously, because it's out of California. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, as a TED, that's obviously a very big privilege. So whatever I do needs to be, I can stand by forever, and I know what I'm talking about, Mm-hmm. So I'm like, well, what can it be? And I'm a stammerer. So I've done lots of study in stammering and therapy and all kinds of things, and I'm very open about that. And the last book I did was about that. So stammering and creativity, because I'm also an artist in various forms. So I banged them together, did some research onto it, came up with a couple of ideas, and that's what I did the TED Talk at the Kadir Has University in Istanbul.
That is awesome to hear. I love that. And like I said, it's a goal of mine. So I bow to you for being able to offer that, and especially on the subject that you covered. And now you mentioned you're a musician. Can I ask what you play?
Yeah, I'm a songwriter. I've been a songwriter since I was 14 years old, since possibly discovering Talking Heads and Prince and The Cure and that kind of era, 1989.
You just dated yourself.
I did a timestamp there. And I started to play in my brother's band on drums, and then picked up the guitar because I realized there was much more in this I wanted to do than just drums, and the joy of songwriting and the poetry and that being combined. And over the years now, I've kind of published 85 songs. You can say 8 albums worth.
Wow.
But with Spotify culture, it's all very mixed up. There's 6 studio albums and 4 compilations. But in total, that's 85-ish professionally published songs out there under Sean B.W. Parker, if your audience wants to go and have a listen.
Well, I'm going to bow to you again. As you can see over my shoulder here, I play guitar also. And I have... I've written my share of songs, although I don't tend to write the lyrics. I write the music because when I've tried to write lyrics, they've always been about depressing, sad subjects. It's just,
Mm.
I don't know why. One of the things that I always talk about with people is when I am not, struggling with whatever or stressed or whatever, I grab, one of the things I do is weightlift, but I also grab my guitar, and that's when it comes out of me. It just seems to do that. I always say I'm not Lennon McCartney. I'm not even George Harrison or Ringo Starr. But I have got my share written and recorded, but not published technically. So kudos to you
Oh,
on
I'll
that.
have a listen.
Yeah, they're mostly they're like 80s type music for the most part. So yeah, I at some point, because people have asked me if I would play guitar on TikTok, and I won't play anything that's copyrighted because that'll get you in trouble. But I might share one or two of mine down the road. But anyway, let's
Mm-hmm.
get into the topic at hand. So, first of all, we kind of talked about your background a little bit, but can you just give us a little bit more about yourself and talk about specifically why you're doing what you're doing with the False Allegations Watch?
Yeah. I'm kind of a writer and artist, musician, academic as well now. And I in 2016, I was running an arts venue in on the Sussex coast here in England, and in the Christmas of that year, I the venue was only open for a year itself. The venue had lost its license because of to serving alcohol without food, which is an issue here, and we were kind of careless on that subject, and so the place lost its alcohol license, and so we had a very bad reputation with the local authorities, which any business person knows is a very problematic place to be. And then a week later, at the peak of the Me Too movement, imported over with Mr. Weinstein and everything else, I underwent an allegation myself um, after what was essentially a one night stand with a friend of mine. The boyfriend reported it, and the next day I was arrested. And then 14 months later, um, the the trial didn't go my way, and so I went to prison. And after that, I had a chance to explore what had happened in sort of sexual politics over the last 20 years. And because I'm innocent, I was innocent then, I'm innocent now, and for reasons I'm sure we'll go into or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I became an expert just from expediency, from having to try to understand what's happened. It's happening to almost every other man at the moment, too. So I'm not destroyed by it. I'm very uh, it's given me a different angle of interest, put it that way.
So, I mean, if you share what you're willing to share about what happened to you. So you were accused, trial happened, go to prison. Can you kind of talk about the mental side, the emotional side of that for you? What it was like to go through that? Um, how how did you get through it? I guess is something that I think we should explore a little bit if you don't mind sharing. And I understand, you may not want to, but I think it's
Fine.
important for gentlemen in particular. And by the way, it happens to women too. It's not. We always have to put that caveat out there. Certainly to the not the same prevalence as it does to men, but when you were going through that, can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you, how you felt, how you coped, that type of thing?
Yeah, it's kind of as you say, it's not a gendered thing anymore. It's such a almost all of my supporters are women, like supporters in terms of exploring the issues with the believe the victims policy, which is what this comes down to. When there's no evidence, when the police in the UK have imported a technique from the US, or maybe come up with they have this system of bad character. So if they don't have evidence, they'll basically go on the local gossip and they will get whatever witnesses they can find who, for example, don't like a venue, whatever reason. Perhaps they used to work for the place, and then it kind of gets closed. And um, I don't want to deflect too much against, I'm an honest guy, and
Mm-hmm.
the fact is that I was living a single life in that place, so I was not particularly chaste. I was, yeah, I was having sex with people, but not in a massively monstrous type of way. It's just like a normal single guy. But I think coming back from a city like Istanbul and having lived in cities before that and going to a small town. that actually has a very big cultural clout, and I don't think I realized that at the time. I didn't realize how it can differ from city to town. So these little cultural things can be weaponized in law. And around the Me Too and around the Title IX stuff that we have in the campus rape situation there, also imported, and the fact that it's now massively industrialized, commercialized, um, means that there's many, many, many men going through it, but there's still loads of shame out there. However, there's less and less shame as the women's, not just the women, but everybody starts to go, well, what is sexual assault? What is rape now? Is
Hmm.
it the touch knee, or is it the violent strange rape, or is it all of these things they're saying? So it's kind of become democratized, is the term that we've come up with for this.
That's an interesting term to use. You know, as I think back to that time frame, 2016, 17, 18, you know, the Me Too movement was in full swing and exploding. And I remember talking even then. And for those that don't know, if you've watched this podcast at all, you do know I am a victim of a sexual assault at 13 by a 35-year-old woman. It occurred over a number of months. It happened multiple times. I was not believed. I was basically told I enjoyed it, and it shows up nowhere in the statistics because they wouldn't even take a police report on it. So I can relate to being a victim and not being believed. And I would always highlight that when I was talking about it. But I also see the other side. I've never dealt with a false allegation for me, so I can't understand it on a personal level. But I've worked with so many different men that have gone through it, and I've heard their stories, and I know what they go through. So I can sympathize and understand to a point. I don't think you can ever fully understand unless you've gone through it, but we can get it. And the point I kept making at that time was, look, I understand what you're saying. I'm a victim too. I was not believed. But we can't throw out presumption of innocence. We can't go to he's guilty just because she says so, because
Hmm.
that opens up a whole other can of worms. And we're kind of seeing that now. And a point you just made that I want to kind of talk and explore a little bit about, if you don't mind, is what's the definition right now, right? So there is no definition. The definition is if it makes someone feel uncomfortable, to take the gender out of it, then it qualifies. Well,
Hmm.
okay, you know, that is such a subjective term because you could walk down the street, brush up against someone accidentally, and technically they could be considered SA, sexual assault, or the whole other side of it. You could actually, you know, physically touch someone, let's say a breast or something like that, and that person may go, it was you know, by accident. I'm saying that person may go, oh, it's no big deal. You know, where do we fall? What are your thoughts on the definitions of it, and to use your term, the democratization of it?
Hmm. Um, it's it's become very convenient for kind of for politicized people within uh, sexual politics and identity politics to extend this as much as they can. And it's work for editors and for academics and people like that, and people in law, for lawyers. And so that becomes its own industry. So it's with the thing you were just talking about with the walking down the street and the touching, etc., by accident. It's kind of sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm.
Then somehow these things become sexual harassment, and if they're like a football coach, like a soccer coach in Spain, doing a kiss at the end of a match of winning the World Cup in public, so there's obviously no intent going on. This guy is suddenly all of his career, his brilliant achievement in the winning of the World Cup is erased by the fact that in his Spanish way, he gets excited and gives a smacker on the lips of one of his um, players, who at the time was absolutely fine about it, but then clearly spoke to somebody else who said, "We can get Mr. Rubiales from this because there's other things about him we don't like."
Right.
So they can extend two things into something much bigger for that guy. To Kevin Spacey has had some great results over the last couple of years on this subject, of course, almost ending certain aspects of the Me Too. Um, nightmare.
It's interesting to kind of refer to the Spanish coach, and I've discussed this on a couple of my social media channels. Is I initially my first blush was we need to step back here and not have an instant response, because we don't know everything, right? We don't know their relationship beforehand. And one of the things that I've pointed out is to say I played sports. I was a competitive rower. I am a competitive power lifter. I was a football player, the real football, not soccer. Sorry, my friend, you're in England. I got to do that. It's kind of fun. It's not uncommon to slap somebody on the butt, hug them after a victory, kiss them. Guys kiss each other on the cheek, you know. And so when I initially saw that, before the allegations really started flying, but when I initially saw it, I went, yeah, okay, they're celebrating a victory, right? That was what was in my mind, coming from a sports, I've been a coach also, from that perspective. And then, as you said, to me, it was like somebody got in her ear, and then an allegation was out. I don't know. I just don't know. I tend to lean towards this is being used as a weapon to pursue an agenda. Because her reaction when it happened, when you look at it, I didn't really see discomfort there, as opposed to if she was truly worried what he was doing. I mean, if it were me, I would step back, right? And I've actually had that happen. I've had women come up to me and hug me, people I know, but I wasn't expecting it. And you kind of do this, you jerk back, right? It's like, not too long ago it happened to me. Someone I know very well, but I wasn't expecting it. She had never hugged me before, but she just came up, no intent to do anything negative, but just hugged me. And I recoiled. She even noticed it. And I didn't see that in that case. And that's why, this is important, the work you're doing, because this is an instance where we don't know if we're being fair either side, but it's worthy of discussion. Yet when we try and discuss it and bring up the other side, and not that we're necessarily defending them, but pointing out some things, they vilify us for it, right? You can't even have the discussion. Kevin Spacey, I honestly can't speak to. I don't know anything about it. I got to be honest with you. I know he was accused of something. That's all I know. I tend to, some of the Hollywood stuff, even like the Depp Heard trial. I didn't watch any of the trial at the time, but so many people were coming to me going, you got to talk about this. You got to talk about it. That I did get involved in it. Hollywood, to me, I lump all of them under the Hollywood. It's Hollywood. It's a whole other ball game. But it's interesting to hear the different perspectives. When you're looking at that incident with the Spanish coach, what was your initial reaction, especially doing the work that you do?
I certainly hadn't seen anything about it until all of the reaction on Twitter, X, and because I did watch the final, actually. Yes, it's just that I didn't see that part of it, and actually, to be honest, it didn't look like a kiss on the lips. But okay, they both sort of said it was, or it was, it just because it was kind of hidden, and he
right.
took her like this.
Yep.
But okay, kiss on the lips like that, whatever. This is not a deviant situation of trying to slip a kiss in. He's doing it in front of the world's cameras, which means that he doesn't see a problem with that. So that is a subjective thing to him. She might have felt not quite the same and wanted to point out the generational gap. Okay, but the Mediterranean countries are different, and that is a good thing. These differences should be celebrated. People are not all the same. Whatever certain forces might want to do to mix us all up to all be homogenous blob, we're not. We're different. The reaction in Spain would be different to the one in Japan. Christ, that would be so unbelievably different. Never. And then America, which is a very mixed place of, I presume, like Britain, of who knows how someone's going to react. But if you go to the reaction as always being the neurotic or the tense or the thing that you're saying, the surprise, is a very natural thing to do, but it's an even more natural thing to go past that, as one kind of normally would. But then when it's added to another story, which is his unpopularity and some money things, that's when the
Mhm.
story emerges. And that's the same with Depp and Spacey and Weinstein, all the rest of them. There's all kinds of the money in the background, isn't there?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting point you just made, which is the difference in the cultures. And you kind of sparked a little thought in my mind. So when we're done with the podcast, I'm going to reach out. I have a friend who happens to be Mexican, so he comes from that type of culture, and he's very affectionate, I guess is the word I'll put. Even with me, right? And it is different. There's a much difference in that culture versus even the American one. You mentioned the Japanese one. There's no touching there, right? And I
Hmm.
think a lot of people don't understand that and can't relate to it. And I agree with you. They should be celebrated for having that willingness to do that. That's what we're human beings. We're meant to do that.
Hmm.
Now, should you be doing it without consent? Okay, we're going to agree, probably not. But in that instance that I saw, and it was shown here live because I did watch that. I don't watch a lot of soccer, but I did watch that. Um, and I did see it happen. I didn't even think twice about it. And in retrospect, as I started hearing things, I'm like, oh yeah, he did do that. But again, going back to what I said earlier, it's just them celebrating the victory. So it's just
Hmm.
interesting to see that, and where it gives us a good point to kind of jump off to what you're doing. So having been accused, and then dealing with stuff like this, you're now part of an organization. Can you talk a little bit about the organization, its goals, and what you do within it?
Yeah, I'm the editor of False Allegations Watch, as you mentioned, and that's a division of an organization called Empowering the Innocent, which is kind of run out of the University of Bristol here, which is a pretty august university, by Dr. Michael Norton, who is the leading expert essentially on miscarriages of justice in the UK. Been writing about them for 20 years and kind of past that. And we work very closely on a regular basis with the CCRC Watch, which is a strand, and then the False Allegations Watch, which is mine. CCRC is Criminal Cases Review Commission here, which is supposed to hold the appeal court to account. So if there are people who say they've been badly treated by the appeal court, the CCRC is meant to hold them to account and say there are issues with this guy. He shouldn't be inside. And of course, we see exonerations now and again, not as many as people are claiming. Um, just to stretch this one out a bit, Dan, there was a guy here in Britain about a month ago called Andy Malkinson, who was sent away in 2003 for rape for like 20 years, always maintaining innocence. And it was discovered that a couple of years into his sort of sentence, the police had evidence, the DNA evidence that it wasn't him, but they hid it for 15 years
Wow.
until about a month ago. And I was let out a couple of years ago, and we're like, look, that is why the CCRC is not fit for purpose. They're not actually doing what they're there to do, which is to look at that kind of thing, because it's too much like hard work, it's too expensive, it's too embarrassing, and so that's what the CCRC Watch is there to do, and that's that strand of things.
Mm-hmm.
I do False Allegations Watch, which is basically how the media treat people who are uh, how this stuff is reported and how that starts to feed into the treatment of the suspect themselves. Calling everyone a victim all the time is one of the worst parts of this because um, there are victims all over the place. But in my case, is that me or is that my complainant? And then in kind of other cases of it, at what point does one become a victim? And what's the point in the word? When in prison, I can tell you 90% of people are victims of something over some point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little kind of frame about what we do in empowering the innocent and the strands that we occupy.
Excellent. So the part that you do is you're working. Is it with the media, or are you just holding them accountable separate? I just want to clarify that for the audience.
Um, it's essentially a blog. It's a website, False Allegations Watch. Empowering the Innocent is a couple of websites,
Mm-hmm.
including kind of innocence art as well. But it's the people that are writing for it are very experienced. They're not kind of journalists and they're not lawyers. They're academic reporters which is what I am now and what Dr. Michael is. So it's like an academic journal done in a way. I like to write to engage the audience. So I don't fill everything with quotes and with kind of references everywhere that's very hard to read. Like, I don't want to intimidate the reader. I want to engage the reader. So it comes across quite journalistic and fun, but the meat of it is actual facts and stats and things like that. So I try to establish that kind of balance. If that answers your question.
It does, and just to point out to the viewers, I'm going to put links to the website down below in the show notes. I've read a lot of the articles on there; they're all well done. There's various people writing, and it if nothing else, it makes you think. It's thought provoking, and that's, I think, what your goal is to say, look, this situation is out there. We don't want to in any way demean an actual victim. That's not the goal. But we also want to point out that we can't just point blank say that anyone that is accused is guilty, and talk about the various levels of that. And I applaud you and your whole organization for that, because this is something that needs to be talked about. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is there's a lot of, I believe, misnomers out there about how prevalent false allegations are. You'll hear various numbers. I wanted to get your opinion, and based on the research you've done, what you know, where do you think, how prevalent is this issue of false allegations?
It entirely sort of depends on how you count. So firstly, which is obviously the difficult place to start, because then if people have a political interest, they will read stuff that they want to read into it. Mm-hmm. But there are some hard stats. So in a British prison, in the prison estate in UK at the moment, there are 80,000 prisoners, and according to Safari, which is a research organisation, about a fifth of those prisoners are for maintaining innocence to some degree. So we're talking 15,000 prisoners at any given time. When it comes to the subject of sexual assault and rape, 75% of the cases that get to court end kind of in a conviction. So it's not the fact that they're rare. That isn't the case at all. But only 1% of them do actually get to court, which means that the 99%, 98, 99 are in some way spurious, or they're not going to get over a certain line. So there are many of these kind of stats that I could. But Mr. Max Hill, who's the director of public prosecutions, CPS, has said in the past that there are, for 1,400, the wrongful convictions kind of per year, mm-hmm. of all kinds of crime type, though, not just sex allegations. So the 1,400 a year is a very, very powerful one to hang your hat on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've tried to research this myself, and putting a quote-unquote hard number to it is impossible. They conflagate a bunch of different statistics, as you just mentioned. And I'm talking specifically about allegations of rape, sexual assault, and I'll even throw in domestic violence, because that's another one. You can't get hard numbers. And I've heard numbers thrown out that of all the allegations made, less than 1% are false allegations. I've heard it as high as 8, 9, 10 in other sources. I've had some people say it's 15, 20. I've had others say 50. That is such a wide range and breadth. The thing that I've noticed, and maybe more so in the States than the UK, is now that they are starting to try and research this a little bit, the one thing they are finding above all else is that these things are coming during divorce cases more than anything else. So the minute a divorce is contemplated, more often than not, it is the woman filing, and it is her making the allegation. And it could be a domestic violence one. It could be a sexual assault one. It could be sexual assault on her or the children. And a lot of the time, it's a he said, she said in family court. If it does get into the legal system, the DA gets involved or something like that, again, you kind of lose that thread of where are the false allegations versus the true ones. And I was just curious, do you see the same thing in the UK? When you're looking at it, is that same paradigm that's out there, that it's not all, but a lot of it is happening through divorce or something similar.
Absolutely. There are all kinds of reasons that the false allegations kind of come about. I'm a lot more comfortable with the terms spurious allegations
Okay.
because, because these days, the nature of innocent and guilty, kind of right and wrong, is so unbelievably stretched and vague, where you kind of can't tell what happened, who did what. Your best chance is down to having an investigating officer who has just been given a target over the last couple of weeks to increase something. That officer will be full of the vim to go and try and get that sort of thing to get that promotion, and that's where it will come in. And if that officer can combine that kind of pioneering spirit with people in their community who are going through a toxic relationship or the end of a marriage, which is very sad, or a suspected local Lothario who they can go and keep your eye on him. If they can weaponize those things, they will. And it's far beyond. And so if you add up enough of those stats done by official diktat from the College of Policing or the Ministry of Defense, Justice, then that is how these things actually work on the street. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, we have all these academics, like I'm not as statsy as others, but they will crunch all these numbers into going, look, that's what's happening, either in a good or a bad way. The fact is, what I've just mentioned is getting the right people behind your case. If you want to take someone down, that's the way to do it,
And for anyone that wants examples of that, I would refer you to prior podcasts that I've done with Ryan Carrison. Talks about exactly that, how there was one or two police officers. For him, it ended up being his entire department that just were after him based on what she was saying. Even when there was documented proof, he was not even in the area at the time he was accused. And then, and he is in the UK. And then I had Jason from the States, who's been completely exonerated. But yet there was one police officer that just was like a shark on a piece of meat, and it wasn't going to let go. And, destroyed, both men's lives were ultimately destroyed by it. And that's kind of where I want to go next, if you don't mind, is to talk a little bit about the effects that it has on someone who is falsely accused. Because as much as I was affected when I was sexually assaulted, I'm 60 now. This is literally 47 years ago it happened to me. I'm still affected by it. Is it affecting me day to day? No, it's not. But there are times it comes up, and it'll never go away. I've healed from it. I've moved on from it, but it's always there. I postulate the exact same thing happens to someone who's falsely accused. And honestly, if I'm being completely open about it, I would think it's worse if they actually are convicted and go to jail, because they know they're innocent and they have to live with this stigma. What are your thoughts on that? What do you see from victims? What are your feelings? I'm curious.
Kind of inside, the people that were married and have gone through what you've been talking about there, these are not the traditional sort of frame of sex offenders in the mind of the West. Some person like going around doing bad things everywhere, and being that kind of. They are just not these people, and they almost always they're just very normal, and they are very, very scarred by the relationship. They do tend to call their ex bad names and stuff like that. I don't go down that line, by the way. I'm much more interested in the authorities than the characters themselves. But the damage that it has is intense, because you're in a Kafkaesque situation where I presume that your viewers are into Franz Kafka, or at least the term Kafkaesque, which is.
I think they would know, yeah.
Yeah, great. So, but it's what it means is that if the authorities have decided that you are something, and you either insist that you're not by facts, or you don't feel that you are, then the system doesn't care about that. And so, because it is the boot stamping, it's the Orwellian boot, and that will destroy any man in the sense of even if he's tough as old boots, it will still really, really damage. And then the appeal process and all the rest of it just sucked into an expensive process system with a couple of people kind of sort of on your side over here and a bunch of other people who are very much not on your side because, well, you've been through the court process. You say, but the court process is wrong. And then, so it's just an endless kind of adolescent storming against something, which is not how a successful and happy life is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that you were is upended. The problem is now is that over the last 20 years, and this show being called "The Men Need to Be Heard," is that there is an action against men in general in certain operated by certain forces, and that's not a conspiracy theory. It's just like spotting out what certain forces are trying to do. So we're trying to protect against that and to highlight awareness of it without in any way demonizing women, because it's not about women, it's about politics.
Yeah, and that's a very key point that they like to say, because I got accused of it this morning, you hate women. No, I don't. All right. Just because we're pointing out issues that men face of any type, but especially these, doesn't mean we're against women in any way or we don't want them to get any help that they need or anything. I want to kind of explore what you were just starting to talk about, which I'm going to call it the system, if that's okay. You know, there is a system that's been developed, and we can go different tacks with it. We can talk about the political side of it, which I'd like to, the societal side of it, and all of that. Just kind of on the top level, when we talk about the system, how would you, I guess, define it? What do you see it as?
I think that in the absence of a conventional war, like a Cold War or a World War II, then the powers that be are interested in trying to keep power by actually attacking their own people, and what is the best way at that time of doing that. And the feminist movement, which has some great things about it historically, also has some very kind of problematic parts, as in the extremism of it, which is basically the 70s idea of all men are rapists.
Mm-hmm.
And that was decried at the time, but it never went away in academia. It's always there, kind of bubbling away. So when the millennium came, and here comes the new century of emotional openness along with the internet, it's like, right, all these academic kooks can suddenly have their voice and it be amplified left, right, and center, and then that get kind of enacted in policy until you get up to 2010, the Equality Act in the UK, and the Title IX Act being properly activated by Biden in the US around that time as well. So then, before you know it, all of the problematic behaviors of students suddenly becomes rape culture. And then in comes the Me Too thing from the entertainment industry, and the pest minister thing in the House of Commons here, where all the MPs who were getting drunk and touching their secretaries before are going to prison for it. Basically, and that starts to trickle down into people just around the community who happen to own an arts bar or something. So before you know it, every other guy in the local bar has been accused of something serious: sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, domestic violence, one of these things. And what used to be serious will suddenly, some of those parts of it will not sound so serious to some women who have actually gone through it in the past in a serious way. So they start to hate the ones that are making the false allegations. And so now we have a massive rump of women whose husbands and sons have gone away. They come to me with their stories, and I report them in emotionally support, whatever. And you listen like you're listening to me, and you try to help them through this. So this strange snake eating its tail of identity politics, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point that you make. Is and I would take it up a level even to anyone who speaks about men's issues or any groups that coalesce around a various issue. If you actually look at the makeup of those, more often than not, it's as many women, if not more, than men that are talking about it or members of those groups, because they do see what's going on. It's interesting how you kind of talked about the feminism of the 70s and Title IX. I even now, I remember what it was like then, and I, for the most part, fully support the original intent behind all of that. You know, Title IX was to primarily in the states was focused on making education somewhat more equal. And absolutely should have been done, no question. But the pendulum went way too far the other way with it, right? Same thing with this assumption that all men are rapists. It's all men till it's no men. It started in the 70s. And it kind of the way you put it, it kind of percolated there, right? It was behind the scenes. It wasn't so overt. And then right around the turn of the century, as you mentioned, it became more internet, right? It became more and more prevalent. And now it's become the norm for society, that assumption that it's all men. And as I talked about in a video I did earlier this week, it's the number, it varies from country to country, but essentially it boils down to it's 0.2% of all men are guilty of violent crimes. That would lump everything in. And the majority of the crimes they commit are against other men, not women. So this paradigm that's out there that, every woman is going to be sexually assaulted simply isn't true. And that's not to in any way minimize someone who's a victim of it. I don't want to be that. But we need to have that honest discussion that this is the reality. And I think the media, and this is kind of where I want to go with it a little bit next, is the media perpetuates that myth. And as you talked about, Me Too come in, and then it just exploded with all that, with, Weinstein, who was a scumbag. I'm not going to lie about it. I just can't stand even the thought of what he did. And I hope he never gets out of prison. As this has gone along, I wanted to get your thoughts on, we've gotten to this point now where this belief is it is all men. And how do you, as an academic and as a man, how do you view that? And how does it affect, let's say, you on a personal level and as you see with the people you work with?
If there is such a thing as a historical patriarchy where the men kind of were in control for hundreds of years, and in certain parts of the world that has been the case, but it's actually based on class and wealth, not on sex, because there's always been the working class men who've had zero privilege, and they continue today, much more, in fact. So that's the political background behind what they've done with men, which is much more convenient than attacking the bourgeois middle class, which would involve attacking themselves. And the problem is that the media has become hegemonized. It's all become very much corporatized and the one message. And if you go against that message with what we're doing here and the podcast revolution in general, which is talking calmly, slowly about specific things, that's a massive threat to the soundbite culture, which is just not all men are bad, but most are enough to make us suspect all. We're saying, well, no, that is not the way. All people are utterly different. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of women out there capable of bad behaviors, whether that be false allegations or violence or all kinds of stuff that we see on X timeline all the time. Bad behavior is universal, as is good behavior. And the fact is we're much more complicated than that. And we're much more complicated than black than white, which is obviously another story for another day.
Right.
So it's all those things start to feed into the media, which around the millennium again got terrified of the fact they were losing all of their money and power because of the dreaded internet. Now that's become very much homogenized again, where all the big papers, the New York Times and the Guardian and the Times and the Telegraph, have now integrated online into their business model. The problem being that lots of them are kind of parentally owned by massive corporate globalized corporation concerns who have their own thing to push, which might be something, again, another subject like sort of trans issues, which are something to talk about another day, because that's we're going into the reversal of nature there and things like this.
Right.
So what we're talking about at the moment is that we have gone from being a position of having built the society we're talking about to being hated by the society that we built. And that is what's happening to men at the moment.
And it speaks to the issues with the men's mental health crisis or men committing suicide and all of that. As I talk about often, when you literally from birth, I'm 60 years old, from the as far back as I can remember, I've heard things like it's all men till it's no men. I've watched, I always talk about the Brady Bunch. I don't know if you had the Brady Bunch in the UK.
Heard about it.
Marsha is still my first love. But if you ever go back and watch that, and I encourage people to do, you will see every single time the girls win whatever contest it is. There was the driving one. There was a whole bunch of them. The girls always won. And as a boy growing up, I remember going, well, what about the boys, And to think that that doesn't get so ingrained, and as these boys are growing up, it's almost othering them. I guess that's the term that's used, or I prefer dehumanizing them. When you're told day after day that you're the problem, you're the cause for everything that happened hundreds of years ago, you need to accept responsibility, you're to blame, you can't help but start feeling dark is the word I'll use, right? And dehumanized, and then you lose that ability to view others as human. And to be honest with you, I believe most of the mass shootings are a result of that. I believe a lot of the committing of suicide is a result of that. And it's sad. And I kind of want to go into the media, because that's a little bit about what you work on, is the media plays into this. I've worked in media. I'm, one of them, or have been off and on. And I always talk about, they don't care about the truth. They care about what's going to sell papers, get you to click on an article or a web page. Eyeballs and ears, they call it in the industry. Whatever's going to get somebody to listen or view is all they care about. And they follow the trends in society. In some cases, they create them because they know divisiveness, and you were kind of touching on this, is going to get a lot of people engaging. And that's what they do with social media. A bad comment is equal to a good comment. So if they can get people fighting online, the algorithms, there's a lot of engagement with that, let's drive that. What are you seeing with that in particular, in general, I should say, but also in particular to false allegations?
Yes, it's sort of unbelievably toxic, as you're kind of hinting, especially with the last sort of 20 years of click culture, having been kind of ramped up over the last 10, isn't it? Really, it's been a kind of gradual thing into how the false allegation. Well, let's go to sort of Depp Heard, because you've touched upon it, and it is a cultural moment in that what I saw as a person who loves the acting of Johnny Depp all my life, fantastic actor, and then his beautiful young wife Amber, whatever, okay, fine, and then a couple of people who are actors, which means the truth is not even relevant. It doesn't matter. An actor isn't supposed to tell the truth. So why are you expecting the truth from them? Number one. Secondly, that's not what we're going there for. But we're all somehow invested in their truth. No, we're actually invested in their beauty, let's be honest, or the fact that we've got a connection to them. And why have I got more of a connection to Johnny than to Amber? That's because I'm a man. And so I can see what he's trying to handle, a person who appears to have entitlement issues and all the rest of that. And then when you go online and you read the comments behind both of their supporters, who are absolutely thousands, the only way to do any of that and to actually have it as a purpose, as a neutral person, is to understand the motivation of the writer. What are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to support how they feel as this person, as a cipher. And that is how to read it and to stay sane. So that was a really good example, watching that whole thing play out, and to not see anyone going to prison, but to see the damage done. But actually, though it doesn't feel like it's a positive thing, it actually is a positive thing, because it was able to expose to the world how subjective these things are. They're not, if you look at it as a neutral person, not as an Amber or Johnny fan, just as a what's going on here, you can see toxicity immediately, and not necessarily from bad behaviors, but from siding with, and then who's got the bigger budget and who's got the the more bots and all the rest of that. And it doesn't matter how much he'd drunk, or if she'd been careless with her behaviors in another way, or been a bit of a bully, all these kind of things. Toxic relationships are that. But we had their casting couch, that's Weinstein. We had their therapist couch on Twitter and Facebook for the world to see. And that is new, fascinating, and very revealing, actually, at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're spot on correct on that. It's interesting because, like I said, I wasn't initially, I didn't care because it's Hollywood and I don't care about that stuff. But I got drawn into it because many of my followers were like, dude, you got to talk about this stuff, right? And so I started looking into it a little bit. And I tried to remain as neutral as possible. And even now, my opinion is basically it was mutual. I don't think either one of them is innocent completely. Do I think it was more on Amber's side than his? Yes, I do. But I'm not going to absolve either one of them for their behavior in any way, shape, or form. What I think, though, and you kind of touched on this, this was a societal changing event, I believe. And I think we're going to look back on this in a number of years and go, that's the moment when discussions started happening about what's going on. And having been involved from the political side of trying to do things like get a domestic violence shelter for men, and hearing time and again, there's no men being abused ever. I mean, a person from the National Organization of Women testified in front of the New York State Legislature saying in all her time, in all her work with domestic violence shelters, she's never seen a single man that's been abused. And believed. That story is now gone, right? And I think you're going to see, because that trial was televised and you couldn't hide what was going on. And the media is struggling with it, I think, even now, because I'm starting to see, maybe you are, the backlash on the other side. So, everybody was like, he's been exonerated. He won. And that this was in the U.S. side. Then it went to the U.K. side and got a little more convoluted. And now you're seeing the backlash. And I'm not talking about the feminist backlash. I'm talking about the media, trying to paint Johnny in a different way. And this is my opinion, and I want to get yours. I think this is them trying to circle their wagons for all they've done for the past 5 decades, saying it is all men. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're completely right. And with the media, it's as you said before, it's as you've hinted towards, it's an amoral beast. To say that the media is a wicked thing is incorrect, because it's entertaining and it's good to be informed and all that rest of it. And it's the color of life, because otherwise life would be out in the fields, which is also wonderful. But it's like, that's what the media is there for, to take you out into this fantasy world, which Hollywood does. And don't forget, over here in Britain, in Europe, we also see it as rather trite or whatever, but it's very entertaining. And so when those human stories become Hollywood stories, it's even more entertaining. So it gets absolutely perfect with that stuff. What it has shown, and particularly what Twitter X has shown, and Mr. Musk appears to be quite animated about this subject, is how one-dimensional sex stories, as in the man bad, woman good, are outdated now. Mm-hmm. That has been very helpful for that, but it doesn't stop the fact that a man, almost intrinsically, almost evolutionarily, I don't know if you're into evolution, but I am.
Oh, I am too.
Is that he is not going to complain. It hurts him to complain. It hurts him to report to the police, etc., etc. It hurts women too. It's just that they've been encouraged to do so in case he does this to other people. Well, he's probably not going to. He's probably only doing it with you because of the special nature of your relationship. But if you mention any of this stuff, you are the enemy. Just by mentioning, the problem with the media is just by mentioning common sense, you somehow become the enemy. and that's why these shows, just like the ones we're doing now, are so important to point out that it's so much more complicated than that. And any political activist, sort of the feminists of either sex watching this, will see that the intentions are good. They're not out there to try to set us back 100 years. That's not the plan.
No, but I think I agree with you completely. But I think their plan, that being the media, is again they're so focused on profit. So if they can create more division and perpetuate basically myths, knowing that 1,000 people will click on it versus if they said, well, it is men that are victims, blah blah blah, they might get 10 clicks or 10 comments. It creates this false perception that's out there, and the point that I like to make with it is you are literally killing people now with this because it has exploded on the internet. And men are, the last number I saw is about 130 odd men in the U.S. a day are killing themselves. Now, there's various reasons for it, but anyone who thinks that growing up and being told you're bad, you're the problem, your entire life isn't part of it is a fool. And I blame the media for that, and I hold them accountable for it, and I get a lot of vitriol directed back at me. What are you seeing when you talk about what the media says, or when you point out differences in viewpoints, let's say, that the media might have versus what you might have? Do you see any vitriol directed at you? Kind of talk about that a little bit.
That's it. You're absolutely spot on about kind of calling out the media, and good for you for doing it. I in a personal capacity, on my personal X, for example, Twitter X, is when I support positions of men for men's rights, of the false allegations, up until the Andy Malkinson thing, which the whole country was behind his case, interestingly. Anytime you even mention the anti-mainstream narrative, which is to believe the victim, you are basically called a far rightist. So to lots of other journalists and people like that, I will be in this sort of far right box. But anyone actually who reads the work will realize that it's not the case at all. And kind of lots of people who used to get called alt-right, we've got a channel over here called GB News, which is, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's only been open a couple of years. During the pandemic, it launched. It's a little bit like an English sort of Fox News, but it's not so strident and it's not always that political. But it's opinionated and it's character based. But this thing is so anti-BBC. It's so unlike the BBC that the BBC are sort of terrified of it, because for mocking it all the time, because they're sort of, look at those stupid plebs over on GB News. And I often share their stuff because it's individually based, individualistic. And if there's anything I've learned about myself in prison and afterwards, in the trial and everything, is that I'm a believer in the individual. So I'm very much online with that aspect of the American dream, but it's an Enlightenment dream as well. So I'm all about the individual. I'm very distrustful of groups, juries, political parties, or orgs, or Depp Heard. Right. All these groups are deeply, deeply flawed, and the media seems to be obsessed with either fitting into one of those groups or including itself in one of them. I don't like that. I don't find it intellectually defensible, even though people don't trust the word intellectual. I do. I like intellectualizing a subject because that takes the emotion out of it. Just like we're doing now, analyzing what's going on. And that's where I get the value. And that's how I hold the media to account, by saying, why haven't you reported that?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the political side of it. I get accused of being far right also. And I laugh about it because I am basically a libertarian, which is, I'm now, I'll be honest, I'm center right. I'll give you that. I believe in fiscal responsibility and stuff like that. But it's funny how we've reached the point where they're labeling anyone who speaks out on any men's issue of any type as far right, alt right, whatever. Yet when you act, and I've talked about this before, and I want to see if it's the same in the UK, when you actually look at it politically in the United States, and I have lobbied I spent years lobbying in New York State with both parties, Democrats and Republicans. If you actually look at how they look at something like shared parenting, it's split 50-50, both sides.
Hmm.
You're starting to see more. The Republicans are starting to realize maybe we've destroyed the family. We got to look at that. I'll give you that now. Okay. I'm seeing that because Florida just passed shared parenting and a couple other things. But if you actually go back 20 years when I was lobbying, for every Democrat that was supportive of what I was lobbying for, I had one that was against. For every Republican that was supportive, I have one against. So what we're saying is the middle of the road, the mainstream, the average person, because most people are in the middle. They're not on one extreme or another. They've now become alt-right, far-right, labeled as such by the way, the other side, the alt-right would say we're far left, which is even funnier to me. But it's they want to pigeonhole us into these boxes with the goal, I believe, and I want to get your opinion on this, of by doing that, they can then use that to dismiss anything we're saying. What are you seeing from the political side in the UK as far as differences in, because you have more than two parties. You have the Labour Party, Conservative. Forgive me on the other one. Do you see similar crossover, and do you see backlash coming from
Uh, yeah, you have just absolutely nailed the current zeitgeist problem that we have, brilliantly. And the fact that this show is called A Man Needs to Be Heard is already some kind of a bat sign for the far right. Just because we have the audacity to say that 50% of the people feel like things have gone too far, and there's loads of women that support them. I mean, that is what the subtitle is. And it's like, nope, you are a bunch of Breitbart reading, GB News watching, Tim Pot hat wearing nutters, as we might say.
I like
and
it.
so so like all of the thing is that the story itself has become quite comedic because what actually happened, Dan, was that about 6 months ago, in some English cities, the residents of those towns, some towns, got upset that illegal immigrants were being brought into the middle of their towns without them being told, and like hundreds of them, and being put into places next to schools and stuff like that. So these very ordinary residents went out with placards saying, "We don't want these people in our towns. We just want to be consulted. We don't know who they are. We're worried." And the BBC and the rest of them just immediately called all those protesters far right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so obvious that they weren't. They were concerned parents who, I don't have much of an edge on the immigration angle, by the way, but these people were just concerned about a bunch of people from the Middle East coming in, being dumped in the middle of their town next to a school. Very perfectly fine things to express, but the price of expressing them being slanted as the far right. So the BBC lost an incredible amount of respect amongst the population of the UK when that was reported by other channels what they've been doing. You see, so that exactly what they would do to our show here now, or to common sense speakers, in my opinion, like Ben Shapiro, shall we, or Jordan Peterson, or all kinds of Steven Pinker, even my intellectual hero.
Mm-hmm.
All these people, just for talking objectively about issues of men, will be called far right, fascist, Nazi, whatever they want to bring out. It's utter bullshit, but we have to somehow bear that and be the adults in the room at the same time. That's why they're killing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's sad, but it's also interesting. And you kind of mentioned Orwellian earlier. I've put this out there before. Everyone needs to go read 1984. It used to be a work of fiction. It's now a blueprint. We're seeing it is. I'm actually starting to reread it, and I'm like, as much as I know, because I remember I've read it 3 or 4 times before. I'm like, oh my God, this, you're right down the line. Orwell nailed it, and here we are. And again, it speaks to how they try and silence anyone who goes against whatever narrative it is. And the normal person, the average person who's just going, hey, I just want to give my opinion, or I want to ask a question, even something like that. I'll use myself as an example. I've gone to politicians, I've gone to the media and go, I live in North Carolina right now. There isn't a single domestic violence shelter for men in North Carolina. There's only two in the entire United States. Can we have a discussion about that? Oh, and they'll throw whatever insult they want at me to try and silence me. It's not because they think I'm wrong with what I'm saying. They know I'm right. But the only way they can silence me is to apply a label to me to discredit me. And I think that happens a lot for those of us speaking out for men in particular, but really any societal issue at this point. And,
Hmm.
I think it's incumbent on us and the work that you do that we call out the media on that. And I have been known to reach out to local media personalities and say, why'd you say that? And you kind of touched on this earlier. Corporates wrote that script. So for those that don't know, back even 10 years ago, when a local anchor talked about something on the news, they wrote the script. Period. They go in a few hours earlier, they write their own scripts. To a certain extent, they still do that, but they're also getting fed scripts from higher up. There's multi conglomerates that own 100, 200 stations, whereas it used to be you might own two or three. And again, it's pushing that narrative. Is it the same, by the way, I should ask, in England where I know the BBC is the big one, but local stations, are they owned by the BBC? Because I honestly don't know. Or are they owned by conglomerates? I'm just curious on that.
The BBC do have a bunch of local stations, which they try to pretend to be neutral, and they do neutral. It's just that they're not very interesting, and they are absolutely battered by online now.
Mm-hmm.
All of these, all of the, the stuff that we're doing now will get a lot more sort of traction than the BBC local, something like that. So they're very aware of that. So it's a complicated picture like yours. We've got sort of 10 broadcasters, TV broadcasters, and about 20 radio stations, but all the local ones as well. And it's a complex picture.
And it is. And trying to understand it is impossible, at least for me anyway. Yeah. So when you're working and trying to, I'll call it hold the media accountable or point out things like that, do you speak with members of the media? Do you engage with them at all? And if you do, what kind of a response do you get from them?
It's a very good question. In the journalists, editors, people like that who are interested in talking to me, or even on a chit chat level, but also professional level, guess what? They tend to have a person kind of around them, close to them, who's been through a false allegation. Mm-hmm. Their friend with their ex-wife, or perhaps it happened to them kind of in the past. And then they're all like, oh, interesting. However, if that hasn't happened, you almost have to have gone through it to really have a proper sympathy with this, it seems. There are lots and lots of guys out there and lots of people in the professions who agree quietly and can't sort of say it out loud, which is obviously big on the trans thing as well, with compelled speech, mm-hmm. which is a big deal, So there are journalists, there are some, they do tend to be on the right. Almost all the people that have stayed kind of with me through the process of the last sort of 10 years from all of it have been right-leaning, let's say, or centre-right, as you'll put it. The leftists tend to be sort of believe the victims at all costs sort of thing. So it's almost like, well, best rid of them. But I'm not like that. I don't see my friendships in a political sense. So I just get sad that they've gone because of those reasons, So that's life. But the journos that hang around do tend to be either objective or on the right.
Yeah, it's interesting because my experience is somewhat similar to yours. I talk with various social media newscasters also, but local broadcasters. I know one who's national. She used to be local in my area, and you talk to them, and one in particular. It's funny, if you watch her on air, you'd think she's far left. But in reality, she's pretty much like me, right? Center, right, in that area. But because she's told what she has to say, and because she's not allowed to say in many instances, because it's got to fit whatever narrative they have. And it speaks to, here's this person. If you actually watched her doing the broadcast, you would think, oh, she's one of them, woke far left people. She's anything, but she hates it. And it's
Mm.
why I had a conversation with her 6, 8 months ago, whatever it was, and she's like, "This is why they're leaving the media in droves." And I see it on my local station now, where the local news station, their turnover is damn near 100% every 2 years, because most media contracts in the States for local is 2 year contracts. Some are 3, but you see they come out of college, they get in for 2 years, they wanted to report. They got into it because they wanted to report. They wanted to tell the truth. And then the editors and the producers are like, nope, you're going to say this. And 2 years
Hmm.
later, they're gone. They just can't handle it. And the problem is we're seeing that affect society, I feel. In particular, it's affecting men, because you watch the newscast, man bad, man bad, man bad, story after story. But always the very last story of any newscast, if you watch, is a positive, uplifting one. Almost invariably, they drown you in blood, because if it bleeds, it leads. They'll drown you in that, and then go watch the next time if you're watching a newscast. Not always, but almost always, it's a positive story to finish it, because they want you to feel up when you leave. But
Mm.
even if you look at those, when you look at those positive stories, see how often it's a man being portrayed as positive. Very
Mhm.
rare. Very, very rare. Um, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you see the same things? What do you kind of, because I'm trying to get the UK perspective versus the US perspective a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a media model, isn't it? And
It
that
is.
that is exactly what they do. And at the end of our sort of news reports, they tend to have a shaggy dog story, we call it, where it's usually a pet
Okay.
of some sort being rescued, but it's always a similar kind of thing. Um, the the thing about the man bad, absolutely all over the place too, almost to the point we're used to it, and we're kind of, but like the metaphor I keep come up with is that the men are being forced to be the adults in the room. They're not allowed to be carefree, sort of young adolescent anymore. That's the reserve of the under 30 women who are um, be yourself, amoral as you like. You're not responsible for your own actions. Enjoy and take the world. That like a 50s teenager or something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good, but that's actually a state of adolescence. That's not a state of adulthood, which is what we, as all men, are now. And even if they're young men, they're being put into an elderly black kind of bracket of irrelevance. And then in the middle, you have over 30s women who are actually frustrated by both of those things, but are actually doing their own thing. But often they might not have had children. And there's another aspect of that with the end of family life. So there are lots of intelligent women who have done what they've been told are now very unhappy. And I'm getting a lot of their sympathy. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
They're like, oh,
Oh,
I'm sorry about all that.
I hear it daily now. Women in their late 30s, early 40s who put their career first, wanted to have that career. And by the way, more power to them for that, right? But
Mm.
now the clock is ticking, and it's 5 minutes to midnight, and now they want that family, and they almost universally espouse regret about where they're at. They can't find a guy, and if they do find one that's potentially good, he's probably taken, and
Mhm, mhm,
two, he's not interested in them at that point. Because if you're a
mm.
40-year-old guy and you can get a 25-year-old girl versus a 40-year-old, I hate to say it that way, but that's biology at work. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
we kind of talk about it. That's reality, and you know, like it or not, we are animals. Whether we want to admit, we may be on a higher plane than say a chimpanzee or whatever, but we are animals at our core, and we are meant to procreate. And men are programmed to look for certain things. Women are programmed to look for certain things. And we've gotten to the point where we're demonizing men for what they look for, but celebrating women for what they do. And again, that could be a whole other separate podcast right there.
Mm.
And maybe we should have that one, because to me, it's a fascinating topic, because when you start delving into the biological reasons and relating it to historical and all that, it's utterly fascinating to me, and it's it opens eyes, I think, when we look at it. I think that's one of the reasons they don't want to talk about that. They just want to put down
Yes.
the patriarchy and that's it. We're not going to discuss anything further, you know. All right, we got a few more minutes. I do want to get into the political side if we could a little bit. Specifically, we know that you're from the UK, I'm from the US, but I will throw this out there for anyone listening. My argument is any Western culture is going through the same thing. And I think, Sean, you'll agree with me. It's kind of driven by the US. You know, what happens in the US tends to then go to the UK, Australia, India now. And we're seeing over time this it kind of morphed politically to now it's just there's nothing available for men. One thing I noticed just this week and last week in the UK, they're talking about a minister for men in the UK, and there's huge backlash on it. Well, we can't have that because they view it as a zero-sum game. If there's a minister for men, it's going to take away from the minister from women, which that's not the intent. Kind of give me your thoughts on how this is all progressing politically, where we're at, and also where you think we're going and what we need to do to kind of maybe change it a little bit.
It's a kind of excellent timing for that observation. This afternoon, I had an article published in Zadavia, which is a domestic violence international organization. To Save sort of Services is their title, but it's called "What Privilege? A Minister for Men," because, as you say, Mr. Nick Fletcher, who is an English MP, has been talking this week in the House of Commons about the necessity for a minister for men, because there's been a minister for women for 20 years, and the problems with these ministers for women is that they have drunk the Kool-Aid of the academic activists, the ideological feminists of the 70s, and they actually put out that messaging too. So, which is basically man bad, and all domestic violence comes from men. And then when you mention the things that you and I know, that, you know, we're not trying to campaign stuff, we're just reporting on things we know, they see that as a threat. It's a threat to the narrative. This guy, Nick Fletcher, is a very soft-spoken northerner, and is a lovely bloke, and he's very, very calm. He's like this, and he's come out and just laid it on the line of what's necessary. He's had to frame it in terms of health. We need a minister to protect kind of for men's health, and if we have this, it's good for women. He's sort of saying he's not wrong with that. It's just that it's not the point whether it's good for women or not. If you're going to have a minister for women, you need to have a minister for men. Otherwise, it's sexist. We would have said in the past sexist. We wouldn't have to use the word misandrist or misogynist and all these other things that we've learned. You know, it's just sexism. And that shouldn't be the case in 21st century Britain. Comes after Tony Blair, 1997 kind of revolution here, basically, whilst Mr. Clinton was operating your country, and him getting House of Commons full of women, which was a great thing and very exciting at the time. The problem is lots of their ideas were unchallenged by other MPs. So affirmative action, which is just like pushing through loads of Vorg laws and everything else, and to the Me Too, these things weren't properly scrutinized, and now we're feeling the effects of it, which is like I've said, every other guy in the local bar has been accused of something, but it's actually a result of all that stuff going unchallenged, because every time we say something, they say fascist pig. I don't care about the labels anymore, Dan. I don't know about you. They just go like this, and that is what I think they're most scared of.
As far as the labels go, it shows me we're winning. And by winning, I mean getting heard, right? Because they're trying to silence us, and they can't silence us with facts or conversation even. They have to silence us by applying that label. That tells me we're hitting home runs, to use a baseball term, scoring a goal, to use the soccer term, however you want to put it, because I get labeled all the time. I've had, you name it, I've been called it, you know, and they almost never try and engage with me in a conversation. And I love when they do. Respectful conversation is the way out of this. You know, with this podcast, I've had and reached out to people who are opposed to what I say, but who I think I could have a respectful conversation with. They won't come on. They refuse to come on. I can't do it. And I'm like, why? I'm not going to attack you. We've had conversations. We can be adult about it. They fear the backlash they're going to face, because if they even show even a glimmer of support for me, even 1 millimeter of support for me or what I'm saying or men, they're going to face a backlash for it. And that's what they tell me. And I'm like, what does that tell you about your position then? That you can't even espouse or acknowledge the other side. I look at feminism. There is a lot of good feminism has done. There is work they need to do. I will be the first to tell you that. And I support those initiatives. But we need to be able to have conversations as adults, much like you and I are doing here. Yeah, we agree on everything pretty much. So I don't know. But I would love to have someone who is on the opposite side come on and engage in a conversation about, let's say, false allegations, because that is a critical topic. It is something that needs to be discussed. And it not just here, but politically. It needs to get in our Congress, our state houses, your legislature. What do you call it over there? I'm sorry, I'm blanking. House of Commons. Thank you. Sorry, I blanked on that. We need to be able to have those discussions. We're not allowed to right now. That's the problem. And that's where the work that you're doing, I want to get back just briefly to because we're wrapping up on time or getting close here. I want to talk again about the false allegations and dive into that a little bit more if we could. So what do you see as the biggest issue within the whole thing? Where is the best way to, one, raise awareness of the issue, and then maybe from there, how can we address it better?
I suppose that exactly what we've been talking about today is the fact that the man bad, as we framed it, is perfect, because they're aware of that. And then I talked earlier about the Andy Malkinson thing. So that has been very compelling in an old school way to the media here. They've had universal condemnation of what Andy Malkinson went through at the hands of the Greater Manchester Police, which is good news because he's a male and he was put away for 17 years for rape, which has been discovered that he didn't do. So that in itself is a breakthrough. This was actually announced on the same day that Kevin Spacey was found not guilty here after being found not guilty in America. But his lawyer, what was most interesting about this was his lawyer said in court, being promiscuous isn't a crime and it mustn't be treated as a crime. And it was such a relief to hear someone high profile having that said. And Kevin himself said, yes, I kind of reached out at times that I've sort of felt lonely, but welcome to humanity. And that is a very eloquent thing for a person in that position to say, because it's very intimidating being in court. So yes, he's a high profile actor, all the rest of that, but also it was good that he was exonerated and also was able to highlight what can go wrong with this stuff, which is basically whatever he had done or hadn't done in the past under the influence of alcohol and as an in the closet gay man, didn't reach the standard of sexual assault that the jury decided, that the academics were saying that's sexual assault. The jury's saying, well, no, it's not. And the country is sort of saying, no, it's not. There's this, in answer to your question, what's the biggest problem? There is a mismatch between what the academic activists want to happen and what the public knows is a criminal behavior. And those are at loggerheads with each other. It's being played out on social media all the time. I suppose it's obvious where I am, but what I want is what you alluded to earlier, which is conflict resolution. I want these things, if they're non-violent, if they're known party, if it's okay, he said, she said, but there's no toxicity involved, just allegations, then to have it out like this or in an actual room and to come to the resolution that way, not to put people away for £40,000 a year, etc.
Yeah, it's in a nutshell. Let's have a conversation, right?
Yeah.
If there's, you talk about the alcohol thing. I don't know about in the UK, but in the United States, it's not in the law, but the general way, there's the law as written and the law as applied. Well, as it's applied, if both parties are drunk, she cannot give consent. He absolutely has by default given consent. So you
Hmm.
get into that. If they're both drunk, they, engage in intercourse. She later regrets it. He's guilty. If he later regrets it, oh no, they were both drunk. It's that double standard that exists. I don't know if that exists in the UK, but
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
it does. So situations like that, better to kind of get the parties together, hash it out, talk about it, and then decide if we need to take it to legal, as opposed to immediately going, he's guilty, because the fact of the matter is, whether it goes to trial or not is irrelevant. He's guilty in the minds of everyone around him. And I've had, like I said, I had Jason on, completely exonerated. He carries a piece of paper with him showing beyond any doubt that he was innocent. And
Hmm.
he's still, nope, that paper doesn't mean a damn thing.
Hmm.
His life is destroyed because of that false allegation. You look at Ryan Carrison, who's over in the UK.
But that was a great podcast, by the way. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
I'm glad you did, and I hope you can reach out to him and talk to him, because I think you guys could do great work together. Ryan's a really good guy.
Mm.
But again, he went to prison and went through hell completely innocent. And we need more people like you and your organization speaking up and saying, no, we can't just assume that, what she says is true. We should take it seriously by every means. It should be taken seriously, but we need to look at a different way of approaching it. It shouldn't be
Hmm.
immediately arrest the guy, throw him in prison, and then we'll worry about the truth later.
Right.
And that's what it is right now. I think you would agree with me on that. And how is that? I mean, just give me your thought on this. How does that benefit society in any way? Do you see any benefit to society at all by making that assumption he's guilty and throwing him in prison?
Um, the benefit to society is again for the activists who are trying to push this agenda, where if at a certain point there's like a consent push in the media, and a person who is operating a bar who's responsible for alcohol, for the handling of alcohol, is then accused of this themselves, then it's going to really help their case if they get that guy put away somehow or other.
Mm-hmm.
So let's use him, and he'll do. And with Andy Malkinson, it was like, he'll do. He's there. And then if you say, hang on, hang on, hang on, hang on, they're like, all irrelevant, all irrelevant. As you were saying about the consent with the drinking thing, exactly the same here. And you can point it out, but the jury don't care. And it's like they don't buy it any more than it's difficult for people to understand how a guy can be sexually assaulted by a woman. Forgive me, but often there's a lot of resistance about that. It's the same thing. People have the cognitive block against certain things happening. So the things that we're going through are in the favor of a narrative which is against men. And it's fantastic thing about podcast revolution and what we're doing now is an ability to talk back about that, not to say, not to have a go at individuals. I'm very much not about that. It's about looking at what's going on in an intelligent way and speaking up for everybody, I suppose, because the women are not serviced by this at all either.
And that's a point that I was going to make is to answer my own question is I don't think society benefits at all from this. In fact, it's really harmed by it. It does not
Mm.
benefit women to have this assumption that the man is always guilty. You know,
Mm.
it, I mean, we could spend the next 2 hours talking about that, but we need to have the conversations. We need, that's the reason I do this podcast, is to get this information out there, and to have these conversations and get people thinking. Because, as you mentioned, if I were to go get brought in as a jurist on a case like that, I can be a little bit more open-minded, I think, than the average person because I've seen the other side of it. Of course, they're never going to let me on that jury, right? Because of, I know, as opposed to most people just, you talked about, well, if a man is sexually assaulted, I mean, that doesn't make sense to me because they, for it to happen, he's going to have a biological reaction. And that's what it is. That's what it was for me when I was assaulted. I didn't want it. My body responded to stimulus. That's all it was.
Mm.
But yet, if it ever, when the police looked at it, no, you enjoyed it, dude. I still to this day I have people say that to me, and I'm like, you don't understand. And then, I point out to them there are female rape victims that have had orgasms during it. Do you fault them for it? Well,
Wow.
that's never happened. I said I can name at least 5 women that I know of that'll tell you what happened to them. It's a biological response. It's all it is. And we need to have these conversations, whether it's through podcasts, the work that you do, because then we're enlightening people and we're creating more conversation. And that, to me, is the way out of all of this. I don't want to take anything away from women, and I know you don't either. We want to level the playing field. We want the same thing that feminists in the late 60s, early 70s wanted. Equality. That's ultimately what it's about. That's my thought. What about you?
I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I just want to bring the love back, I suppose. But I don't want to be seen as a complete hippie on your show either. It's just that, we're we're good people who are being put through the mill, and we've sort of had enough of it. And I think the best thing is that we're talking openly about it now. And if I can say sort of fascist pig as I did earlier without us both getting cancelled, it means we're making some sort of progress, aren't we? And
Yeah,
saying
well,
it ironically, of course.
I'm not cancelable. There's nothing they can do to me because I don't care. The only way you can be
It's,
canceled is to care that you're being canceled.
that's right. It's the best thing about going to prison, etc., is that you're uncancelable as well. It's like, go on then, whatever. You're not bothered.
What else are you
So
gonna do to me, right? I mean,
totally.
Sean, I truly appreciate you coming on, and the work that you do, and I want people to know how can they help you with the work that you do. What could people do to kind of support you, other than maybe read your articles for starters? Because I encourage everyone to go
Wow.
do that. But what else could they do for you?
So, always good to be read, of course. I'm as vervain an author as anybody else. If they do a Google search of Sean B.W. Parker, which is my pen name, Sean B.W. Parker, they've got my Amazon books to have a look at. They can listen to my music on Spotify, have a look at the videos on YouTube. And as we've been talking about False Allegations Watch, that will be there under a separate search, or under the link tree. Just go into that and have a read through the things you've been reading this afternoon. We're very proud of them. We've been doing it for a year, and we're going to carry on doing it because it's an ongoing project. And obviously, the story is, this is a part of that story. So this is the live version, and hopefully it'll be able to be seen on Empowering the Innocent TV too, which is a little sort of channel Dr. Michael's got going on. So it's like an ecosystem of all this stuff. It's all very well-meaning, and it's all very non-misogynistic, and talking about the stuff that we want to talk about, just like we have now.
Amen to that. And I will put show links or links in the show notes to all of those things that you mentioned. I'm going to go listen to your music because I'm fascinated now. Any other final thoughts that you have, Sean, before we wrap things up?
It's been wonderfully expansive, and I'd love to come back and do a second one about the wider politics and all the rest of it. And if anybody has been through false allegations and all the rest of it, and if they've gone to prison, because these things don't always go well. It has been said just recently, this can be a very scary story. And don't forget, I did a lot of this to myself by opening a bar and putting myself in front of the public. So if you're going to do something public facing, the degrees are slightly, though others can get, of course, falsely accused. But I did do a bit of this to myself because I was asking for the attention from the council. Council gave me the attention and chucked me in prison. So it's not necessarily going to happen to absolutely everybody. Maybe just to point that out to your viewers.
Yeah, I mean, those of us that speak out too, it's always in the back of my mind. I'm waiting for it. It's coming. Somebody will make an allegation, and
Wow.
when you're, I mean, I'm not pretending I'm a celebrity by any means, but I am somewhat of a public figure. We all face it,
Yeah.
like I said, I've talked with people in the media at all levels. They do legitimately fear it. And rightfully, I had a death threat a month and a half ago. I mean, legitimate death threat, like serious. And it's like we've reached a point in society where how is that the norm? And it's becoming the norm. And how sad is that? And I definitely do want to have you back on to talk about the political side more, because I don't talk politics on here too much, but for those of you that have listened to my radio show that's all politics on that. So, but anyway, Sean, again, thank you for coming on. As I said earlier, I'm going to put links to all your stuff down in the show notes, and I encourage people, go read the articles. I haven't listened to your music yet, but I'm going to assume it's awesome. And who knows?
You assume correctly, sir.
Who knows? Maybe someday we can get together and jam.
I'd love to.
I do want to get over to the UK at some point. I've never been there. I was actually supposed to go to London in 2009 for rowing, but it just didn't work out. We were going to go over for the Cambridge. I'm blanking on it. The rowing.
A Henley Regatta.
But yeah, but it didn't work out. But anyway, again, thank you, Sean, and we'll have you back on soon.
Brilliant.
All right, let me go ahead and wrap things up on that note. Hey, if you've watched this far, do me a favor, give us a like. One of the things, as what Sean and I talked about during the podcast, we're trying to spread the word. This isn't an anti-woman show. We're trying to benefit everyone. And the best way to help us do that is by liking and sharing the show. It pushes it in the algorithm. Yes, I'm shamelessly plugging, but that's what we have to do, because people like YouTube and Spotify and all that, they're not going to push subjects like this as much as they would things like the narrative that they want. So you help us by simply going down and hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel, right? I have a podcast comes out every Sunday at 11 p.m. Eastern US on various topics related to men's issues. And if you subscribe, you'll see those, and you can always support the channel also through various ways. Just go down in the show notes. You'll see all that stuff. I won't belabor it here. And I do sincerely thank all of you for watching, and look forward to talking to you the next time. So on that note, you guys have an awesome week, and I'll see you next time. It's Dan from Men Need to Be Heard.